They seem to have lived better and longer in many respects. Now, when the climate shifts again, and I know how this sounds like a climate determinist argument. I think that would be false. I think we're at the moment of thinking through climate over the long duration. When the climate improves across this arc of early medieval and then, of course, famously in high medieval Europe, the aristocrats rebuild their power, reassert their control over the countryside, build powerful conquest states, famously in the case of Charlemagne, but then later in the case of feudal monarchies, especially in England and France, and essentially roll back the gains of the peasants in the era of favorable climate, at first beginning in the 660s and then robustly after 950. So there's a sense in which more favorable climate across the past 2,000 years feeds into eras of new class formation, new kinds of class structure, and the new eras of the caging of the peasantry. So high medieval Europe is very much based on the warming of the period 950 to 1250. And as soon as the climate changes again, and we get the Little Ice Age right around the year 1300, we get a rolling series of contradictions. Now, the Malthusian story is remarkably consistent and just as wrong for it, which is too many people on the land. Look at the demographic explosion, and you can see how many people were living in places like Normandy in 1250. And the thing is that it wasn't too many people on the land. It was the feudal model of agriculture, which had yielded tremendous gains over the previous 3 centuries. But through interconnected processes of soil exhaustion, rising problems with weeds, and then climate change, the monocultures of the feudal era were no longer capable of yielding increased gains and increased agricultural surplus, which was a problem because aristocrats do what they do, which they always need more and more and more and more. So that set in motion a big problem. So draw your parallel to the crisis today, where we have a crisis of stagnating capitalist agriculture and a ruling class that is ever more bloated. Anyway, in the early 14th century, you have not a Malthusian crisis, but a set of what I would call Marxist crises of land and labor and bodily health and demography, all at the same time. That you have first rolling the return of famines on a large scale in the early 14th century, and then famously, as we all know, by 1347, the Black Death. Now, feudalism wasn't brought down by climate change or the Black Death or by famine. It was brought down by an unprecedented worker and peasant revolt. And what we need to keep in mind here is that this set the stage for a new era of a new golden age for peasants and workers, much as the collapse of Roman power 1,000 years earlier had yielded a golden age in peasant livelihoods. So, and this is just one of many charts that gives us a sense of the increased living standards for peasants and workers in 14th and early 15th century Europe. So, you're beginning to see the picture. Climates come, there's political destabilization, even civilizational crisis. There are moments of political possibility, of social revolt in one way or another, and the possibility of golden ages and the living standards for the vast majority. Now, from here, we have a moment of a kind of climate puzzle, which is capitalism develops in conditions of life and conditions of climate that were extraordinarily unfavorable for feudal Europe and for Roman power in the West. So how was capitalism able to not just emerge but consolidate itself through this long, long in historical terms, Little Ice Age? And that's something that we have to take to heart, because the climate conditions of the emergence of a civilization are really sort of etched into that civilization's DNA. And so it's not just that climate comes in at the end and causes problems. That would be maybe a start, but not where we need to go. So how was capitalism able to emerge through the Little Ice Age? Well, let's change the terms of that a little bit. Capitalism emerges through a climate fix from the beginning. And it is a climate fix that accounts for, that is really at the heart of capitalism's profound geographical extroversion. While civilizations before had pulses of territorial expansion and all the rest, never before have we seen a kind of transoceanic division of labor and colonial transoceanic empires knitting together a system of cheap nature on not just such a vast transatlantic scale, but on a progressively globalized and planetary scale. And at the heart of this is what I call putting nature to work. So this takes us beyond going to look at all the terrible things that capitalists and empires do to land and bodies and all the rest. There's plenty of that, and we know that. But that's not why capitalism works. Capitalism works because it can put nature to work as cheaply as possible. And at the heart of that are the ethnic cleansing campaigns that emerge out of Iberia in the late 15th century, that culminate in the invasion and conquest of the Americas in 1492. That was the last of three great ethnic cleansing campaigns that began with the reconquest of the Canaries and then the final assault on Granada, the last kingdom on the peninsula. Here is a representation drawn much later, probably 19th century, of the fall of Malaga. Columbus was there then, and it was a moment at which every single one of the city's inhabitants was sold by the Spaniards, was sold into slavery. Every single Muslim and Jewish inhabitant in Malaga was enslaved. And so that gives us a sense of how not just coerced labor, but also conquest and also finance and credit were enmeshed at the beginning of capitalism. This was the model that was carried forth. Why were they selling slaves? Well, they had to sell the slaves to pay the bankers. So this again is a story of Genoese capital. Of course, Columbus comes from Genoa. So this is a story of how did this profound geographical extroversion take shape and on a planetary scale, and how is it premised on cheap labor and genocide. We're all very familiar with the catastrophic demographic history of the New World invasion. For the present purposes, what I want to highlight is what Lewis and Maslin call the Orbis spike, global spike. That red line that you see going down very abruptly, 1550 to 1610, is the dip in carbon dioxide concentrations is a direct result of the New World genocides. The forests grow back, absorb the carbon, and all the rest. That reinforces a solar minimum and volcanic activity to produce some of the most severe winters in the whole Little Ice Age in the 17th century. And what happens during this period of severe winters? Well, here is a map from Jeffrey Parker of the political revolts and rebellions, not just across Europe, as you'll see, but all across the Americas, across Afro-Eurasia as well. So again, between the 1630s and 60s, the most intense phase of the Little Ice Age, you have a period of profound political instability and crisis. Well, why didn't capitalism enter into a terminal crisis at this point? That would be the expected result if we were a good historical sociologist. I'm not sure that I am. But if we were, we would expect that to happen. Why not? Well, in short, because of the drive to the frontier, frontiers of all kinds, the Baltic, the fur trade and all this, but what really, really mattered was slaving, slavery, and sugar. So drive ever deeper into the tropical zone of slaving, bring the slave sugar system to northeastern Brazil, and then to the Caribbean. And this would be extraordinarily fundamental, not just in reshaping landscapes everywhere, not just in drawing the world color line, but even if our attachment is to something called the Industrial Revolution, is to the source of the capital that financed the Industrial Revolution. About a third of British capital formation in the late 18th century came from the British West Indies and from the West Indian planters. So that's no small thing. So again, we have this drive to the tropics and the formation of global colonial empires, if we're being really schematic here, we can see this is the ultimate solution to this. Now, I wouldn't be so schematic as that, but it's worth entertaining that as a simple idea. So, the Industrial Revolution, and which also germinates at the very, very end of the Little Ice Age, is a replay of this story of the drive towards the tropics. That's a bit crude, but it is, again, the reconstitution of a productive apparatus around genocide and slavery and new epoch-making machines. For some reason, we regard the steam engine as the epoch-making machine and not the cotton gin. We probably need to rethink that, because there's no steam engine in industry without slavery and the cotton gin. And of course, the cotton itself was of a variety that had been tuned and developed over millennia by American Indians. It was a strain of cotton that could withstand machine working. And that's not a small thing. And lest we forget, in a wave of orthodox Anglo-centric Marxism, that slaves engaged in the class struggle as well. All right, so how do we wrap all this up? I'm going to move through this a bit. So we have these iconic images of the era of the Vietnam War and of the Cold War space race. We've met the enemy and he is us. That's, of course, from the first Earth Day poster, Walt Kelly's iconic poster. I think we'll come to this at some point. Blue marble, this is what Al Gore keeps in his office, as iconic a photograph of the environmentalism of the rich as we can imagine. And that it feeds into a kind of profound ahistorical sense of possibility and a return to populationism in many senses. So this was really a way of ignoring, or of a kind of ruling class response to the world revolution of the long 1960s. This was an era of the most rebellious and contentious and revolutionary period of capitalist history ever. Now, not for nothing, Malthus himself wrote at the end of the most contentious and revolutionary and unruly period of capitalist history up to that point as well, in the late 18th century. Not just the Haitian, French, and American revolutions, but many other revolts and rebellions around the world. So Earthrise, and by the way, Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth Catalog was a student of Paul Ehrlich at Stanford in the 1950s. These are the kind of iconic images of environmentalism, and are really an iconography around how to ignore the world revolution in 1968. We'd never seen the whole planet before. Yeah, we had. It's a representation. It's a globe. We had globes for, since 1492, even earlier. So this was the era of, we're all in the same boat, we're all on spaceship Earth, all of this. Richard Nixon loved environmentalism, right? We're, the second message, State of the Union message, says, we want to restore nature. This is a cause beyond party and factions. This is just really, really great. Let's all get behind this. Of course, the word ecocide itself is coined during Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, and Nixon is uttering these words whilst the United States is engaging in chemical biological warfare in Southeast Asia. So this is very important. When the United States supports the first Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment in 1972, it insists that two words cannot be mentioned at the conference: Vietnam War. So this is not for nothing. And while there have been many valiant people struggling against this current of mainstream environmentalism, there is still this moment at which environmentalism has and continues in many respects to play a really profoundly anti-radical role. It's a kind of geocultural counterinsurgency. So now I'm going to run ahead a little bit here so we can just take stock of where we've been and where we are, because there's a lot here. So there's basically two questions. There's a long history of climate change and civilizational crisis that we can get rid of man and nature, and we can put some version of a climate class nexus at the center. We don't need to be orthodox about it. We can be we can think about how we want to refine and elaborate that, but I think there's something really fundamental to that. It doesn't mean we ignore the hockey stick charts. They're real. They say something. These geophysical moments are significant, but they are not the whole story. We have to put representations like this together with representations of capitalist crisis and stagnation. You don't need to believe in the world rate of profit here, or whether it declines, or how important that is to get the point here that there is a tendency for capital to produce way more wealth than it can profitably reinvest, and that is a long-term secular problem for capital. But that's not the only problem of secular stagnation. What happened to the labor productivity revolution we were promised, you know, like in the 70s? We were supposed to get the robot factories. Very few robot factories. So we have a long-term stagnation in labor productivity growth, and even more serious from the standpoint of capital is the long-term stagnation in agricultural productivity growth. This is true both for physical productivity and labor productivity in advanced capitalist agriculture. So, how do we get to where we're going? Well, I think that we have an idea of the solutions, but we don't yet have an idea of the analytics that will allow us to get there and allow us to develop the kind of political alliances across these domains of work. So capitalism organizes three great domains of work in the modern world. Paid work, of course, is the favorite domain of Marxists and neoclassical economists and everyone else. The unpaid work of human nature is overwhelmingly done by women, is of course the central concern of feminists, and the unpaid work of extra-human natures has been the overwhelming concern of environmentalists. The problem is that at best we get a linkage between two of these, and we need to find ways to draw the internal connections between all of these in the history of capitalism. Capitalism thrives when there are great frontiers of unpaid human and extra-human work. Those frontiers are not only geographically over, but climate change is moving the web of life from a cost-reducing opportunity to a cost-maximizing force in capitalism's business as usual. So let's remember, big climate changes mean fundamental problems for ruling classes. So that's one key moment here. The geophysical moments of climate tend to get wrapped up with geohistorical crises of power, production, and reproduction. So, how do we start to move beyond this? We've had these discussions around the Green New Deal. I'm sure we'll unpack these. Is this a useful place to begin, or is it more of just adding up adding up nature and labor in some problematic ways? First of all, we need to be resolutely and radically historical. We need to understand the origins of planetary crisis to get out of this silly man versus nature model. We need to remember that Marx was not a labor fundamentalist. Indeed, he famously criticizes the German socialists for ignoring not just nature, or external nature as he called it, but he reminded them, and the Marxists never like to quote this, that labor is itself a manifestation of a force of nature. So, we are back to asking these bigger questions about, if we go historically, then we can answer a fundamental question about our times. And I'm not going to say which is which, but I think that we're in an epochal crisis. That's where I'm leaning towards. If this is a developmental crisis, like we've seen before, like we saw in the 17th century, the long cold 17th century, then one kind of politics is necessary. In the present, but if we are in an epochal crisis, like the crisis of feudalism, then different kinds of politics are absolutely necessary. So, what does a world ecological imagination speak to? Well, as I mentioned, to engage climate change geohistorically as greenhouse gas molecules entangled with climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid, and the crisis of world accumulation. I think it involves making ontological demands for the 4 Ds, for decarbonization, democratization, decommodification, demilitarization. And then I think it means that we need to decolonize our anti-communist environmental imaginaries. I hear this all the time, well, the Soviets destroyed their environments as bad as the capitalists did. That is not true, first of all, and killing Nazis is a big ecological plus in my book. So, I'm not saying we all need to, get a Politburo and have forced industrialization. one of my students, Roberto Ortiz, talking about Cuba during the special period after the end of cheap Soviet oil and the turn to agroecology. He says, you know, it could be a special period, but with resources. So that would be very different. And there are key lessons in the experience of desperately poor countries that have been totally destroyed and under constant threat of invasion and military conflict. There are key lessons to draw from those experiences that have sadly been excised even from the radical environmentalist imaginary. So those are a few thoughts I will leave you with today. Thank you very much, and we'll have a Q&A after.